Okay, so I'm Avni Patel. I'm a cloud software engineer at CloudReach, and we're a consulting company that basically helps enterprises get to the cloud or build their applications in the cloud. And I'm talking about working with serverless functions in CI/CD. And mostly I'm trying to focus on the developer point of view. So a lot of you guys were talking about running serverless workloads, but this is more about running them on AWS or GCP or Azure. Okay, so as a developer, you basically, you're using something like Serverless Framework or Terraform to build out your application. And when you do this, you use your framework to build out a bunch of functions and a bunch of infrastructure. There's probably should be like more infrastructure down there. And then your functions will use the infrastructure, whether that's using them like an event trigger, so they're using something to like as an infrastructure resource, or they're using some kind of library to like let's say you have DynamoDB and you're pushing to a table or something like that. So yeah, and then as a developer, so you're not just writing your code anymore. Yeah, so you're not just writing your code anymore, you're writing your code. Hopefully you're writing a bunch of tests, so you have unit tests, integration tests, load tests, depending on like how many tests you're writing. And then you're also building out your infrastructure, and then you have infrastructure tests. So hopefully you have all those tests, but I mean, maybe you don't. And then when you're working with a pipeline, what you're doing is you're pushing your code and you're trying to build out all of the tests and making sure everything builds. And then when you do this, the time to actually deploy your code takes a while, right? So for example, if your infrastructure code is like building GKE takes like 20 minutes to build out a cluster. And then you have to wait for that every single time you push, and then like some of your components don't take as long, but there are components that take a while. So yeah, so your continuous integration process is slowed down as a developer, as you have to wait for your pipeline to build. And then, so how do you deal with that? Like, how do you deal with all of those components and building them out? And then how do you deal with code promotion to different environments? That kind of speaks for itself. So basically, like you want to make sure all your infrastructure components work with your code. And then you have a whole bunch of code that depends on infrastructure directly. So you want to make sure that you're testing every single part, right? But then when you actually are developing, so like let's say your serverless framework is only using a S3 bucket or something like that, and you only create the bucket once and you never have to recreate the bucket. So most of the time you're only pushing your code and you only have to worry about those tests, right? So why are you building out every single other component and checking it, right? And so the first thing you can do is decouple your code from your infrastructure as much as possible. And then I actually saw this second thing in the serverless framework best practices is that if you have two different functions that are actually using the same component, then just take that infrastructure component out of your like Lambda function and then just put it inside of a separate repo and just have that run on its own. And then, so integration tests can be your best friend. So for example, I was working on an application and we had ECR and then we had DynamoDB. And so we made a change and someone had a microservice that they changed the version to, so the endpoint changed. And then when we were running our Lambda functions, the integration test wouldn't fast because the endpoint changed. So it's a good way to make sure that all of your components are working together without having to make sure that your entire pipeline runs every single time. And then, so you should still be running your infrastructure pipeline every single time, but your developer shouldn't have to wait every single time you run, right? So you want to break up your code pipeline from your infrastructure pipeline, but still have the code pipeline trigger your infrastructure pipeline. And then so the different components don't matter as much. So I mean, it doesn't have to be like your code pipeline is just running build tests, integration tests, and then like you're not doing a Terraform plan and apply. But you should have different pipelines so you're not waiting as long. And then, so there's like different patterns for your serverless code. So for different patterns, you want to do different things. So for the microservice pattern and the service pattern, you want to have different pipelines per microservice and per service. So this helps with continuous integration. So you're only making sure that your service is building and passing every time. And then the integration to every single function should be able to trigger the integration. And then for the monolith pattern, you basically want to run all of your tests because since all of your code is highly coupled, you want to make sure that everything works all the time. And that should also be able to trigger infrastructure pipeline. Okay, so then another problem that we would run into is that the developers, even though they would push, it would just take forever to have everything build out. And they weren't testing their code locally, so they'd have that huge pipeline, and then they would mess up at some point, and then they would just have to start over. And like one of the pipelines we had was like 50 minutes long, so they would wait until the last component just for everything to fail. So one thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you're having your tests run locally first. So you can create like a Docker file that has like all of the tests and just run that, or like we had pre-commit hooks, so you couldn't push unless everything was passed, or like some certain things were passing, and then, or like running a script that just has everything that you need. And then also just make sure your integration tests are like really, really well put together. And then when you actually do promote your code, you want to make sure that the entire pipeline actually does pass, because you don't want to make anything fail at that point. So like, let's say you're pushing to dev, you want to make sure everything runs. You don't want to you want to make sure your merge request passes every single component. You don't want someone to push to dev and ruin a different function, things like that. Okay, and then, so for every single pattern, you want to have a different type also, right? So for microservices and services, so when you promote your code, you should run your microservices pipeline and then push to the infrastructure. And then in every environment, you should be making sure that everything passes for that. And then obviously, so you'd be pushing features. You wouldn't be pushing your entire, like all of your changes. You'd be pushing. So for every feature should be inside of a separate function. And then, let's say you have a microservice architecture, and then all of your microservices are under different folders. So what you would be doing is that you would push those features for that folder. That folder would trigger its own pipeline, and then that would trigger your infrastructure pipeline. And then if you're doing that in like dev, then that would then make sure that everything in dev is running correctly. Okay, yeah, that's all I had.